everyone, I'm Erin from Red Buffalo Coffee and Tea in Silverthorne, and these are your virtual home coffee brewing classes. Join me over the next couple of videos as we talk about the quintessential elements to brewing coffee better at home. Hi everyone, and welcome to your Seed to Cup beginner class for your virtual home cafe. We figured what better ways to get to know how to brew better than to get to know the product itself. So of course, the big question is going to be, what is coffee? First of all, coffee is not a bean. It is not a legume. It is not related to the black beans that you put in your chilies or anything like that. It is the seed of a cherry of a coffee plant. The coffea plant resembles a small shrub or a small tree, and there are two main species. There's the Cafe Arabica and the Cafe Robusta, and within those are many subvarietals. You might hear someone say that they really enjoy Geisha or Bourbon. In most Central American countries, you're going to get Catuai and Caturra. But generally, why do plants make caffeine? Well, it's a natural insecticide. Caffeine is bitter in its natural form and even when brewed, and bugs generally don't like bitter things. So most plants that have caffeine are going to be bitter. So things like your yerba, tea, and coffee are all plants that we drink for a caffeinated benefit, but that are generally bitter and that bugs do not like that. If you notice the image on the right, that is the anatomy of the coffee cherry. And if you go zoom in right to that middle, that is where the bean resides that we know of it, is also the seed. And you'll notice, give a good eye at the fact that there's a cherry, there's a pulp, there's kind of a skin layer, because all of those will play into how coffee eventually tastes. But knowing how coffee tastes, we have to understand where it's grown. Coffee grows in what's called the coffee belt between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And like all agriculture, climate and soil will affect taste. Think about wine, think about chocolate. All of these different products are going to have certain tastes depending on where they're grown. Also, things like climate change will really impact that too, or if there's been big climate events. If you guys can remember the 2004 tsunami that went through most of Southeast Asia, thousands of lives were lost, but also the economic impact where a lot of these countries exported coffee. And because the coffee plant itself takes years to mature, they were not able to export their coffee the way they were. And you couldn't get good Sumatran coffee for a few years after that tsunami. Also, Mexico has had a really bad fungus for some of its coffee called rust, and it's just been taking over a lot of their plants. Things like climate change are also going to impact the available land that we have to grow coffee on. Coffee doesn't necessarily enjoy growing coastal, or it does, but it likes to grow at a little bit of a higher elevation. And so as the planet warms and it becomes warmer down lower, coffee wants to grow a little higher in elevation to keep to a slightly cooler temperature that it likes. I'm not saying it likes a cold environment. You could never grow coffee in Colorado, but it does like to be a little bit higher. And so as we get lower down or hotter down low, it wants to move up high, and there's just less available land as you move higher up in elevation. But again, that is where your coffee grows. Keep in mind too, things like soil. It really likes volcanic soil, but the type of volcanic soil and the elements in there are really going to impact how that coffee tastes as well. So after the coffee plant has matured, generally it's grown in little nurseries, and then as it gets to a bigger plant, then it's planted within the farm itself. And the farm, there's a lot of different ways that they're grown, but typically we try to source from what are considered your shade grown areas, where you have your coffee shrub, a smaller tree, down low, and then it's getting shaded from larger fruit-bearing plants. We've been working with Specialty Coffee Association to also understand how to work with farmers to diversify their crop products. So not only do you grow the coffee plant, but you might have large fruit trees above it with like mango. They also would have vegetable gardens below the coffee plants. And a big one too is now getting honeybees involved with the pollination process, because believe it or not, There is some studies coming out that there's a taste difference between hand pollinated coffee plants and naturally pollinated coffee plants. So by having a diverse economy, as we all know, coffee is grown generally in less economically strong countries and communities. And when you grow coffee, and you farm it, you usually only get 1 to 2 payouts a year. And that's really hard to sustain yourself on. Imagine if you only got paid twice a year and had to budget your entire family life around that. So by increasing the diversity of what a farm can produce, like fruit and vegetables and honey, then you can increase the economic activity of the region. But let's get back to the processing. Picking, there's hand selection is key to getting good ripe cherries, because when you go to larger estates and they use machines, you're getting the yellow cherry that's not quite as ripe. You might be getting overripe cherries too. And that cherry, believe it or not, does go, the flavor goes all the way down to the seed. And so working with farms that employ hand selection is going to get you a more consistent taste, and get away from some of those deformities that we might experience in a machine picked farm. But how then it is produced after it is picked has a big influence on taste. And this is some things that you're going to notice in your specialty coffee shops is what's called natural processed, honey processed, or washed processed. The wash process is the most common that you're going to see. And after the coffee is picked, the cherry around that seed is going to be washed off, and then they're going to be put in fermentation vats before they are dried. This generally leads to a more floral and acidic coffee, some of those lemony notes. This is really common in high water countries, countries in Central America where there's a lot more water, in countries with a little bit less uh, natural rain, you're going to see more of a natural process coffee. Countries in Africa are going to be more likely to employ a natural process. The natural process is before the cherry is husked off, it is dried on the seed. You'll see them in these large um, drying beds out in the sun, and then you're going to take the cherry off of it after it is dried. These coffees lend themselves to a lot more of those berry notes, those blueberries, and then of course, depending on the varietal and the soil, you might get some more chocolate notes too. Of course, roasting is going to impact that, and we'll get into that soon. The newest trend you're going to start to see also is honey processed. And this is when the cherry pulp generally is washed off, but they're not fermented. So that pectin layer around the seed is still there, and it has these rich, sweeter notes to it. So again, you can go back to that anatomy of the coffee cherry, and you can see which parts are being pulped off in which part of the production and why they would lend themselves to different taste profiles. Of course, we need to talk about the folklore of coffee, because this is a really fun bit to understand that coffee goes back so far. The legend says that the effects of coffee were discovered by Kaldi and his goats. Kaldi was a goat herder in 9th century Ethiopia, and he was resting, and he noticed some of his goats were acting very peculiar, bouncing around and dancing about, as he said, after they've been eating these cherries. And so he started to eat these cherries as well, and sell them and market their properties. However, the first documented evidence of coffee drinking as a beverage and how we know it from its tree really didn't start for about 800 years after Kaldi and his goats, so the 7th century in Yemen. And that's when they realized that you could roast the seed to make a beverage out of it. There were a lot of interesting trade restrictions that came around coffee and the plant. They were trying to really make it proprietary, but of course, as with anything, it can get smuggled out and eventually got its way to Europe. Now, because coffee was from Yemen and it was considered the drink of the infidels, these non-Christian souls were drinking this beverage, and it had to have been condemned because surely it was not the drink of civilized people. Of course, these are old times. We do not at all believe in these adages today. However, when Pope Clement III tasted coffee for the first time, he said, well, why should this be only a drink of an infidel? And so he blessed coffee as a drink from the gods, and then allowed all of the Christian community to also drink coffee. a strange way about it, but ultimately, as we worship the cup every morning, coffee is blessed. Coffee also has its roots in the American Revolution. The Great Tea Party in Boston Harbor, only the English were drinking tea, so we shouldn't drink tea. So, what's something else we could get our hands on? And thus, the American Revolution spurred coffee drinking in the United States. It is also presumed that the ideas for the American Revolution started in a coffee shop, cafe style environment in Boston around that time, influencing the idea that coffee shops and cafes truly are a place for conversation and community. So I told you we would get to roasting after our processing ideas. And with roasting, after it has been picked and sorted and processed, it gets shipped around the world to various roasters. Ultimately, roasting enhances coffee's own inherent flavors. You want to be able to kind of talk to the coffee as it will and let the coffee speak to you. Roasting is a combination of temperature and time, and the smallest degrees of variation are going to have such an impact on this. But ultimately, coffee is best 7 to 10 days after roasting. I think it's very important to note here that when you are buying coffee, really do try to support one, your local coffee shops because they generally support your local roasters. Also, they're getting your coffee fresh roasted. They most likely are paying attention to the idea of working through their coffee stock within 7 to 10 days so that nothing goes stale. You will get to later in our conversation about oxidization and how you can lose the essential oils and gases that are naturally found in coffee. And when you let coffee go past those ultimate roast dates, you start to lose a lot of those essential gases and oils that you would see in there. So when you talk to your coffee shops, ask them about their roast date, ask them about their profiles. But that's the big difference that you're not going to see in a large grocery store when you buy your coffee. Because in a large grocery store, they generally have to have a shelf life of up to 6 months. To accomplish this, generally speaking, you have to go what's called a denitrogenization process. And the larger commercial roasters are going to have these large machines that take out all the nitrogen from your coffee bean. And ultimately, what this does is it's kind of, if you had your beer, it's going to be it's like an uncarbonated beer. And no one likes that. No one likes a flat beer. So again, it's really important to buy your coffee knowing its roast date, and ultimately your local coffee shops are going to have usually a fresher batch for you, and they can tell you when your coffee was roasted, and also its origins and its varietals, because those are going to be really important to understanding taste and appreciating the process that the farmers went through to get you an amazing cup of coffee. So knowing a little bit more about coffee here, like we said, millions of people will work to get those seeds to your cup. And if we don't respect the process and who we get our coffee from, we ultimately aren't doing justice for this product, and we can help increase quality every step of the way. Coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world, and for most countries in Central and South America, it is their top exported product. And if we want to worship this product every day and continue to support a global economy of coffee, then it behooves us to know how to best enjoy it. I'm going to leave you here with these final 15 steps from coffee, from bean to cup. You can kind of pause the video here and look at this. But thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you do enjoy the next few videos as we start to work with the coffee at hand. Thank you so much for tuning in to your virtual home cafe class. We look forward to teaching you so much more about how to make the best coffee at home.